Welcome,
I can do it.
everyone.
Yeah.
We're going to get started.
It's like what George Bush
So,
said, senior, he said,
Find a
"I don't like
seat.
broccoli."
We are
If the
here
President of the
for
United
the
States
Pinkel
said
Lecture
nobody's gonna
today,
make
which is supported by the Benjamin and Ann Pinkel Endowed Lecture Fund. This is a lecture fund that was generously donated to us by Sheila Pinkel in honor of her parents. Benjamin Pinkel was a Penn student. He got a Bachelor's of Science in Engineering and Electrical Engineering. And he was someone who was interested in philosophy of the mind and actually wrote a monograph on the subject entitled Consciousness, Matter, and Energy, The Emergence of Mind in Nature in 1992. And the Pinkel Lecture is endowed to support to bringing in scholars who are interested in similar questions as Benjamin Pinkel was about the philosophy of mind, the relationship between the mind and the brain, et cetera. And it is always a highlight of the cognitive science calendar here at Penn. I'm going to hand the mic over to John Truswell, who's going to introduce this year's lecture.
All right, great. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to introduce Susan Goldin-Meadow. I don't have to tell this audience that Susan is a major figure in language and cognition and the broader field of cognitive science. But what's particularly special today is that we're welcoming her back to Penn. Susan got her PhD here in psychology, studying under Rochelle Gelman and Lila Gleitman. And I wanted to particularly highlight Lila because I've seen over the years the influence that Lila has had on Susan. Lila was a dear friend of Susan's and of many of us. And I've seen that Susan has really a strong interest in her students, their ideas and their futures. And I'm sure she experienced the same thing here at Penn with Lila. In addition, she's gone on since leaving Penn and gone to the University of Chicago and done great things studying, doing all kinds of interesting work on gesture and in particular home sign, the invention of structured communication in children who don't have access to language originally. And it's really revealed a great deal about the deep underpinnings of innate constraints on communication, the very important work that she's done on that topic. She's also done amazing research on gesture. I think at first naively, I thought, well, gesture is just a sort of a side part of communication, side part of language, but she's demonstrated that it's really deeply rooted in linguistic systems and language and communication, but also deeply influencing thought. It's really part of a way of supporting cognition and cognitive development, and the work is really quite inspiring and really terrific. It's also the case that Susan is a huge influence in the field because she has been involved in almost all of the major, different programs and institutions in cognitive science that promote cognitive science. She also has been a huge supporter of cognitive science over the years in many different ways. In addition, her honors really do speak for herself, for themselves. I actually have a list here. I want to make sure I say a few of these. It's really hard to overstate her influence on the field, and also the honors really do illustrate this. She has received the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Ruml Prize in Cognitive Science, and most notably the election to the National Academy of Sciences. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming one of our most distinguished alums, Susan Goldin-Meadow.
Thank you. Can people hear me? Yeah? No? Yes? Okay. All right. I'll try to speak up. If you can't, yell at me or something. Thank you, John, for that wonderful introduction. You actually stole a little bit of my thunder because I was going to say two things about why I am thrilled. I will say them again. Of course I will say them. about why I'm thrilled to be here. One is because I am an alum of the graduate program. I'm actually going to give you the number. It was 50 years ago. 50 years ago. That is a significant number. And the only person who's left on the faculty, yay! The only person left on the faculty from when I was here is Marty Seligman. But I have to say there are a couple of young people on this faculty who we tried to hire at the University of Chicago. So I sort of feel like I know you guys too. We just lost out. And the second reason I'm really thrilled to be here is because although I felt as though I was trained by the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, the entire faculty, I just, when somebody said at the end of my 4 years, who are you trained by? Who was your advisor? I said, everybody. It was everybody. And it was a wonderful way to be trained. There were two people who were very, very influential. And I have sort of structured my talk to reflect the influences of both Lila Gleitman and Rochelle Gelman. Because really, I owe my career, the trajectory of my career to Penn. So here we go, the trajectory of my career. The mind hidden in the heart, in our hands. And this is not going to work. Oh, it decided not to work. It did work a minute ago. You know, oh, did we not do it? What did we do? Working now? No. Nope. Should we try the other one? I know. We could move it over here and then I can punk it. I just don't want to stand behind the. The mic isn't working either? Swallow the mic kind of thing. Better? Better, okay. As high as I can go. How's that? Even better? Okay, I can pin it on my nose, but I won't. Okay, now, so this is working now, sort of? Yeah, and then I just, no. It's not working at all. Nothing's working. Oh, now it is, okay, all right. No, okay. All right, well, let me begin here. So many people think that language is essential to thought, and this, of course, is clearly not right. And it's not right on many, many counts. But what I'm going to do today is to talk about one count, one piece of what I think is really good evidence that language is not essential to thought. So what I'm going to talk about is children who aren't exposed to language can invent one. And they use their hands to do so. So their minds are shaping language, obviously. It's not the other way around. So this is one of, to my mind, one of the clearest pieces of evidence that you can think without language, unless, I mean, because you can invent your own language. So this is the first part of my talk, which is really beholden to Lila Gleitman, and you will see her name sprinkled throughout. And it's going to be the first part of my research and also the first part of my talk. Now let's see if I can make this happen. Okay. But most of us do learn a language. We're exposed to one that we can see and hear, and we learn it. So what do we do with our hands? Well, it's quite clear what we do with our hands. We gesture, okay? And these gestures, the point that I'd really like to stress is that the gestures reveal thoughts that are not revealed in our speech, and they're thoughts that we may not even know we have. So this is the second part of my research, which has been influenced most by Rochelle Gelman, and it's going to be the second part of my talk. So this is my, let's see, this is a challenge here. Okay, so I'm going to talk first about the mind hidden in our hands that are creating language, and second about the mind hidden in our hands accompanying language. Okay. All right. So to start, I want you to imagine a far-fetched scenario. This is like not going to happen, but I want you to imagine it nonetheless. So imagine that all languages, spoken, signed, written, are gone, just wiped out. But we are who we are. Our culture's the same. Everything remains the same. And the question I want you to think about is, would language reemerge? Would it come back? And your answer to this question depends upon how you think about how language evolved in the following way. Okay. No, now it doesn't want, oh, there it is. Okay. All right. So if language looks the way it does because it's been handed down from generation to generation to generation to generation, it might not come back. And if it did come back, it might look really different. On the other hand, if language looks the way it does because we structure it in our own way, we communicate using our own structures, it might not only reemerge, but it also might look very much like what the languages look like that we're currently, like the languages we lost. So that's the way I want to frame the question today. In a sense, what I'm asking is how resilient language is. Was it a one-time invention, or can it be reinvented de novo? Okay, so the first study of this sort was reported by Herodotus in 429 BC. He tells us of an argument between two kings, an Egyptian king and an Phrygian king. And they were fighting over what was the natural language. And being kings, the only languages they considered to be possibly native are Phrygian and Egyptian. But a little bit unusual for kings, they decided to settle this not by battle, but by experiment. So what they did, according to Herodotus at least, is they took a shepherd and two kids. They knew enough to have two. Told the shepherd to take the kids out into the mountains, feed them, water them, make sure that they lived, but not give them any input, under penalty of death, not to speak to them. They came back in 18 months and looked at their little experimental preparation and found that both children produced the word bakos, which means bread in Phrygian. And there the matter has rested for many, many years. Now, even before the IRB got serious about our experimental manipulations, this was a tough study to replicate. You really can't just sort of, people aren't really likely to give up their kids. But we can take advantage of what I've called an experiment of nature, to look at children who are deprived by circumstance, really, of a usable linguistic input. And then the question is, can such a child reinvent language? So who doesn't have linguistic input? Everybody's got linguistic input. Well, it turns out not everybody can use it. So there are young children whose hearing losses prevent them from acquiring a spoken language. And all the devices in the world can't help them acquire the spoken language. In addition, they're born to hearing parents who can provide them with speech, which is useless, but they cannot and do not provide them with sign language. So for all intents and purposes, these are sort of as close to my crazy situation as you can get. They're experiencing the cultural world that we live in, but without a conventional language model. Okay, so what do these kids do? They might sit in a corner and look at themselves, but in fact what they do is they start to communicate with others, and they use their hands to do so. And these hand movements have been called home signs. Okay, so here's an example of a home signer. He's a deaf child born to hearing parents in the United States. He's about 3 years, 8 months, I think, here. He's sitting looking at a Richard Scarry book. It's a picture of a shovel stuck in sand. So it's a sand shovel. He points at the shovel and he starts to tell us all about what you can do with the shovel. You can shovel it, whatever. And then he starts to go off on a little bit of a tangent. And he tells us that the shovel can be used when it snows and when you pull on your boots, and that you use it out there and keep it down here. So he's looking at a sand shovel, but he's talking about a snow shovel, which any hearing kid might do. So here he is. He's talking to Heidi Feldman.
Shovel, shovel.
In the winter time.
Oh, yeah, that's a good
Shovel in the winter time. Yeah, yeah.
Outside?
And it's snowing.
Oh, and it's snowing. You got a shovel.
Snowing.
Right. Oh, I see. Where's the shovel?
Where is it? It's in the garage.
There it
There.
is. Downstairs. Oh, there's the shovel. Oh, Dave.
So this is work I began over 50 years ago with Heidi Feldman and Lila Gleitman. There is no question that this child is communicating. Big question about whether or not it's language. We did find structures in this child and in all of the children that we looked at in the US. And surprisingly, the structures looked a lot the same, which wasn't exactly what we expected. So we thought maybe there are cultural pressures that are pushing these children into a particular kind of structure. So we decided to go to another culture and see whether children would be home signers there too, and if their home signs would look the same. So this is a deaf child of hearing parents in Taiwan. She's looking at the same picture book, but she's picked out a picture of a swordfish. It's actually a pretty friendly looking swordfish, but she's decided to say that the swordfish can pierce you through your heart, make you dead. This is a gesture that Taiwanese people use. It's an emblem like, okay in English or in this culture. Make you dead, pierces the heart, make you dead. It has a long nose and it can swim. Okay, and at some point her hearing sister comes in front of her and she uses the gesture system to talk to her too.
死掉啦！真的啊？死掉哦，真的，鱼刺，他说的是一个大的，不晓得什么鱼。这个，他说他鼻子尖尖的。
You might have noticed that gesture. Usually we think of gestures as symbolic. Hers was on the edge since it had a little more force than it needed to have to talk about piercing her sister's heart. Okay. But it's clear that she also is using her gestures to communicate. And surprisingly to us, the gestures, again, were structured in very similar ways. We had sort of expected, well, we did expect a little structure from these kids, but we didn't expect them all to look in the same way. And that's something we should talk about as we go on. Okay, these are the resilient properties of language, as we've called them, that we found thus far. There are a few more that I haven't even put on the list. We have properties at sentence level, the word level, language use. I'm going to give you a quick example of each of these. So in terms of sentence structure, the kids would string their gestures together, and they'd string them together in an order. Not 100% probabilistic, but pretty good. So in this case, what the kid is doing is he's pointing at the grapes. He's doing an eat gesture, an action, and then he's pointing at me to say that I eat grapes. Or he's asking me if I want to eat grapes, actually. Okay, notice that's not English word order. In English, we would say you eat grapes, and this is grapes eat you. That's the pattern we found in this kid and all the American kids and in the Chinese kids as well, in particular that the patient occurs before the action. Each of the home signers developed sort of lexical items, and those did differ across culture at least a bit. So the hearing kid, as in the US, you've already seen, he uses an eat gesture like that. That's not a surprise, you would too. But the Chinese kid does this, which no American kid would ever do. Okay, that's not a surprise. This last one, it was a little surprising to me. I don't think that anybody would invent a gesture system to talk to themselves. But once you've invented it to talk to somebody else, these kids actually use it to talk to themselves. So this child is sitting next to his sister, playing with clay, looks at the clay, decides he needs a knife, plastic knife. He gets up, starts looking around, and he gestures, he does. And he's not looking at anybody. These are clearly gestures that are intended for him. And in fact, if I gave him something at that point, he would reject it. This was really for himself, which I find a little striking. Okay. So one question that you may be asking, because we were certainly asking of ourselves, are these linguistic properties, were they invented by the kid? Or maybe they're hearing parents who gesture, of course, every hearing parent gestures. Maybe the hearing parents invented the gestures and the kids are just copying them. So in order to find out, we went to Nicaragua and looked at the and the US. We looked at the hearing parents of the home signers in Nicaragua and also in America, and looked at the gestures that the hearing parents produced as they talked to their kids. And we analyzed those gestures using the techniques that we use to analyze the deaf kids. That is, we didn't use the speech because, of course, the deaf kids can't understand the speech. So we looked as an example, there are many other examples, but as one example, we looked at hierarchical structure. So these children, this is very simple hierarchical structure, but it is hierarchical. Complex noun phrases in which two different gestures within a single phrase refer to the same entity. So you can have a gesture for airplane, a gesture for mine, which is a unit. It's over there. Okay. So here's an example, Nicaraguan kid doing this. He does airplane, mine, over there. Okay, so now we look for both of these in Nicaragua and the United States. The home signers are in red, the family members are in blue. As you can see, the home signers do a lot more of it, particularly more in the United States, but there is variability. And so we thought, well, maybe the parents who do a lot have kids who do a lot, parents who do little, kids who do a little. So we tried to look at an individual level. And what we found is nothing, actually. What you see here is that the hearing family members on x-axis, home signers on the y-axis. As you can see, none of the American mothers did this, 0, but their kids did. Even in the Nicaraguan moms, though, the mom who did it the most had a kid who never did it. So there was just no relationship between what we saw in the parents and the kids. This is the most striking example, and it really makes me believe that these children were coming up with this. They can invent the rudiments of language. So recently, I've started to speculate that these linguistic properties emerged through biological evolution, because they don't require transmission in order to be developed. And so if so, they should appear in a variety of language, perhaps not all languages, but a variety, more than none. English, Spanish, and Chinese were the examples that we used. And this is work, ooh, it got louder. Is that better? That's better, okay. Okay, now you can hear the rest of the talk, that's good. Okay. You want me to start over? Okay, no problem. Ooh, it feels louder too. All right, so we looked at universal constraints on how languages categorize events involving tools. Okay, so here's a picture of a rabbit cutting oranges. And if you describe it that way, it really, cutting seems to evoke a tool. But you can also describe it as a rabbit making orange juice, in which case a tool is not as central to the event. So Lilia Rissman, whose work this is, has looked at events like this described in a bunch of languages and found that there's a lot of agreement about what's a tool prominent verb. So when one language describes it, uses a verb that's tool prominent, other languages are likely to do that as well. And the question that we wanted to ask was, are these events described with tool prominent verbs in home sign as well? Okay, cool. What's tool prominence in home sign? So it actually turns out to be easy to distinguish tool prominence from non-tool prominence. So this is a kid describing a knife. And what he does in the first part is he does this for a knife.
It's about getting up in the morning and getting dressed and eating.
Okay, there's his knife. Okay, which is clearly making the knife salient. The same kid describes the same picture using a handle. So focusing more on the agent. Oh, and he didn't do it. Okay, come back. No. There he is. Okay, did you see that? All right. So what we did was we divided the words in the spoken languages. They had to get the tool prominent in all 3 languages or be tool prominent in none of the 3 languages. We divided up the verbs, and then we looked at what the home signers did. And what we found is that this is one Guatemalan home signer, more likely to use these instrumentals for tool prominent verbs and than for non-tool prominent verbs. That's one Guatemalan kid. We found the same pattern in all the Guatemalan kids. In addition, in Nicaragua, Taiwan, Turkey, and it's there only a little bit in the United States, but we can talk about why that is so. So it does look like that the patterns found in a bunch of languages are coming up in home sign as well. So when a tool is prominent in an event, it really looks like it's a universal constraint on languages that are invented and a strong bias in languages that have evolved over time. So this reinforces the point, really, that linguistic properties home signers developed emerged through biological evolution. But I'd like to hypothesize, maybe if it's going to work, okay, is that the linguistic properties that home signers do not develop are at least good candidates for being developed by cultural evolution. This is not an easy division into biological and cultural evolution for properties of language because it's already happened. But I think that home signers give us an interesting way of looking at this problem, or at least a set of hypotheses that we can check out in other ways. Okay, so I'm going to go and now talk about Nicaraguan Sign Language as a way to think about dividing the world into properties developed by biological evolution and properties developed by cultural evolution. So Nicaraguan Sign Language is an interesting test case. All sign languages, as far as we know, grow out of home sign. But Nicaraguan Sign Language is growing out of home sign right now. So in the last 40 years, or maybe a little longer now, deaf people were brought together for the very first time, and they started to interact with one another. So before they were brought together, they were home signers, and I've portrayed them as little individuals in eggs, because that's how I think of them. They're deaf people surrounded by a bunch of hearing people who really can't communicate with them. So they're little eggs into their own homes. But at some point, all these people were brought together, and they could then interact with one another. Whereas home signers produce gestures, home signs, they get co-speech gesture in return. So they never, ever see home sign. They produce it, but they don't see it. In contrast, when the kids are all brought together, they not only produce it, but they start to see it and use it for communication. That's called the first cohort of Nicaraguan Sign Language. That's the beginning of it becoming a conventional system in that it is shared. What then happens is over time, new deaf kids come into the community, and here's this language that is growing up. They see it, and they start to learn it. So this is more like a learning situation where they have a model, they change it. They don't just acquire it, they change it. So we see changes there as well. So we have a situation of creation by individuals, which I'd like to suggest is biological evolution. We have creation through communication and creation through learning, which I think are good candidates for cultural evolution. So what I want to do is give you examples of each. Now, I've shown you a bunch of examples already of fundamental properties of language in home signers. Pretty obvious ones, you know, putting a patient before an action, things like that. This property is less obvious, okay? This is a property that Lila Gleitman held near and dear to her heart all of her life. She began working on symmetricals when she did her dissertation. These are two events, and they appear to be symmetrical visually. If you look at them, there are two people who are high-fiving one another, or two people who are punching one another. And they are symmetrical to the eye. But it turns out that languages treat these events differently. So that in English, we can say John and Mary high-fived. But we really can't say Robert and Nancy punched. It's just not right. What you have to say is John and Mary punched each other. And other languages have other ways of distinguishing between symmetrical and reciprocal events. This is English's way. The question is, do home signers and subsequent generations distinguish between these events? Okay, so you can imagine that the easiest way of representing a symmetrical or reciprocal event would be to do a mirrored thing, like I did before, actually. High five and punch each other, because this actually looks like what the event looks like. The other way to do it, though, is to just do it in an asymmetrical way. You can do it high five like this, or high five like this, punch like this, or punch like this. Okay, so what do they use? Well, as it turns out, home signers and all the subsequent generations tend to use the mirrored forms for the symmetrical, as we would expect. But as we might not have expected, they use the non-mirrored forms for the reciprocal. What they do is they'll punch out and punch in. I find that very, very interesting because it's not two events. well, it may be two events, but it's two events happening simultaneously. So they've taken an event that occurs simultaneously and made it sequential. And that happens not only in home signers, but in every single generation, suggesting that this quality of languages, which feels really abstract, which Lila always believed in, is there from the start. It's something that we have brought to language, and we don't need generations to get there. Okay. So now, let's think about a property of language that doesn't get, it's not, did I do that? I moved a little. Is that better? Okay. It's not there in home sign. It's not there in NSL1 either, even though they're communicating with one another. It really requires learning. Okay. And that is indicating more than one. So there are two ways of indicating more than one in home sign. One way is to say there are 4 cups, discrete little signs. Here it goes. This is a home signer. Okay. Another way is to do it sort of more smushy. Tuk, 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 tuk. Just a little bit of, one movement with a bunch of little bumps in it. Okay, now that second one can be used for a variety of numbers, not just for 3, but for 12. Okay, so we wanted to look at how they do this. So we gave them 2 kinds of trials, either no agent trials, where a bunch of objects were sitting right there, or agent trials where a hand came down and put down a variety of objects. Okay, so what did they do? All right, so in no agent trials, all 3 groups, home signers, NSL1, NSL2, they used both forms, the discrete form and the plural form. No difference, really. It's just equal opportunity here. But for agent trials, home signers only used the discrete form, as did NSL1, but NSL2 was happy to use the plural form. They have learned, it's not like they learned the form. Everybody knew the form. But they learned how to generalize it and make it a marker for plurality. So that it's only when home sign is transmitted from one generation to the next, when it's learned, that the plural marker is generalized. There are a couple of other examples that we have of this as well, but I find these very interesting because these might be the properties that need to be acquired by cultural evolution. You're never going to find them in the de novo language. They're only going to evolve from a system that has already been invented. Okay, so what we've discovered from home sign is that home sign gives us a window into properties of language that emerged as a result of biological evolution, at least by hypothesis. They can be reinvented by a child, and they are the fundamental properties of mind that are shaping language, not the other way around. We also know from Nicaragua, the emergence of Nicaraguan Sign Language from home sign gives us a window into factors that make language into what it is today, that grow in response to cultural evolution. Okay, so that's what we can discover from looking at the mind when it is playing the role of language. Oh, one more. I have to tell you one more thing about this. So language is resilient. Are other things resilient? We can use home finders to ask about other properties. So one of the properties we looked at was their understanding of number. This is how we did it. We gave them a little scene, a bunch of little sheep, and the sheep moved. They did things. And they did things in numbers. And then we asked them to describe what they did. Okay, so here is our home signer describing what he did, huh? There he is. He's pretty good, actually, I think, in the way he describes it. I think it's pretty accurate. But the question is he accurate with respect to number? So we looked at the number of objects, and we knew how many objects were in each scene. And then on the y-axis, what we had was the number of fingers that got raised to represent the number of objects. And what you can see is that they were great at the small numbers. but they got really much more smushy for the big numbers. So they had small exact numbers and large approximate numbers, which shouldn't surprise anybody. This was a limited time, okay? If I asked you to do it, you'd do it in exactly the same way. We asked unschooled hearing aid controls, and they did it in exactly the same way, as did signing controls in Nicaragua. That's in a limited time. But if I gave you an unlimited time, and if I gave these controls an unlimited time, they'd be great. But you can give the home signers as much time as you want. You can sit there all day with them, and they will still be approximate. They are good at small numbers. They're good at approximate, which many animals are also good at. But this construction of a large exact number is something that seems to be beyond them. And in that sense, language is more resilient than number. Okay, we can talk about that if you'd like. I've been wanting to write that on a slide for years. Okay, so now we're going to move into the mind hidden in the hands accompanying language. So language is resilient. It comes out of the hands, out of the mouth. When it can't come out of the mouth, it comes out of the hands. It exhibits all these properties. Okay, so what do the hands do when they're not being used for language? Well, they gesture. Okay, all speakers gesture. Here's an example. It's a young woman. She was asked how to get from here to there, and she gestured.
Just tell me everything that will pass as we walk through.
Okay, well, the front door, there's an entryway, and so as soon as you enter the front door, you're going to see Dash's shoes on the right on the floor because they're dirty, and so I don't take them in. And he'll come in, and he'll bend down and pick them up, and I'll bring them to you, and he wags his tail. He's so funny.
Okay. So there's sort of nothing unusual about her gestures. There's something a little bit unusual about her. If you look at her, she's sitting with a dog. That dog is her seeing eye dog. She's blind. She has been blind from birth. So think about that. She has never, ever seen anyone gesture. Why would she gesture? She gestures because gesture is really tied to speech. It's a resilient aspect of speech. She will even gesture when she's talking to a blind person who cannot use it. So this gesturing stuff is something that's really robust and resilient. Okay, so are they more than hand waving? Well, since it's the whole second part of my talk, the answer to that one is yes. So gestures reflect what we know, and it can even change what we know. And that's what I'm going to try to convince you of. Okay, so this is work done by Becky Church 1,000,000 years ago. We use the conservation paradigm that Rochelle Gelman introduced me to from Piaget, where we show kids two rows of checkers. They have an equal number of checkers in them, and then you spread one out, and you say, are they the same or different? And you're supposed to say it's the same, as I think you all know, but there are many children below the age of 8 who say they're different, and they are called non-conservers, and they have good reasons for it. Here's one child telling you a good reason.
Do these 2 rows of checkers have the same number of checkers? No. Which row has more checkers in it? Now, why does that have more checkers in it?
You spread them apart, and this one stay like you put them down.
Okay, so she says, if you couldn't hear it very well, she says you spreaded it out. They're different because you spread them out. They are different because you spread them out. She also gestures that you spreaded them out. Okay, they're different, but they don't happen to be different with respect to number, which is the point she missed. However, she's conveying the same information in gesture and in speech, produced a match. Watch this one. This kid is also saying they're different. And he's also saying they're different because you moved them. But watch his hands. He says they're different because you moved them. And if you notice, this isn't how anybody moved anything. That's really aligning one row of checkers with another row of checkers, which is just the beginning of one-to-one correspondence. If you get that, you get conservation.
Do our rows have the same number of checkers in them now or different? Why is there a different number in our rows?
Because you moved them.
Okay, so this one has produced what we've come to call gesture-speech mismatches. He talks about moving them, but he gestures one-to-one correspondence. When we first discovered these kids, it was a surprise, actually. And the only way we could discover it was by coding gesture and speech separately. When we coded it together, we didn't even notice that the information was different. which I think is actually telling in and of itself. But okay, so we now code them separately. We discovered there's a mismatch. We sort of started thinking about whether they're cognitively equal, these kids. Thought maybe these mismatches might be more ready to learn because they actually know a little bit more about the problem. So we gave them all instruction, okay, and we just saw how well they did. So what I'm presenting here is that children who produce mismatches are ready to learn conservation. The ones who produce mismatches prior to instruction are in blue. The ones who produced only matches are in white. And here you see the proportion of children who improved. Mismatchers really were ready to learn. It's sort of interesting because if you listen to these kids, you think that they are identical. There's nothing about them that you can learning, being ready to learn. But if you open your eyes and look at how they gesture, you can say that one's different from that one, and that one's ready to learn. Okay, but maybe this is just about math, 5 to 8 year olds, whatever. So we went about conservation. So we went to a math problem to see if it was true. Simple problem, 3 + 4 + 5 = blank + 5. It turns out that many kids in America, 4th, 5th grade, don't know how to solve this problem, which is unfortunate. And what they do when they get it wrong, it's either they add up all the numbers on the left side and put 12 in it, or in the blank, or they add up all the numbers in the problem and put 17 in the blank. Okay, so here's one who was asked to solve the problem. Oh, but 7 is the right number, which I think you all know. Just in case, just checking. Okay. So here's one who put 12 in the blank and says it in gestures.
How did you get 12 is your answer?
I added 5 and the 4 and the 3. Can't hear. Okay. So she's produced a match. Add up all the numbers. Okay. This one, on the other hand, she looks the same, but in fact, what she does is she points at this 5 and then points at the 5 and the 4 and the 3. Okay, and says the same thing.
So how did you get 12?
I added 5, and then the 4, and then the 3.
If I can make this louder.
All right.
Okay, so she's produced a mismatch. She talks about adding up all the numbers, to the left side, but gestures about adding them all. And it turns out that she also, and kids like her who are mismatchers, are more ready to learn than the matchers. So it's not just gesturing or not gesturing. They all gesture. It's the relationship between their gesture and their speech that is having cognitive significance. So these hands really are reflecting something about the way we think. Okay, so gesturing predicts what speakers know, but can it change what they know? So in order to really look at that, we have to make kids do it. We have to make them gesture, because otherwise we'll never be able to tell whether it's gesturing itself that makes a difference. So we taught the kids to say, I want to make one side equal to the other side, blah, 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 make an equalizer strategy. And one group had no gestures at all. Let's see if I can make this louder. Yeah. I know he had a little, there was a thing that I could, you know? Oh, you don't know how to do it, or you do know how to do it? Let's see. It was on this one. Oh, is it? No, maybe it's that one.
Or just all.
Yeah, right. Okay, hold on. Let's see if it's this one. Otherwise, you're going to be blown out of here.
I'll take one side equal to the other
That's
side.
better, isn't it?
Okay, now you put your answer in.
Okay. All right, anyhow, he talks, but he doesn't gesture. Then we told this one. Okay, they were taught to say exactly the same words and to produce a gesture. So they point at the 2 numbers that are supposed to be added and then point at the blank. Okay, a sort of a grouping strategy. Group these in.
All right, so first of all, can you say the words and do the hand movements exactly like we practiced?
I want to make one side equal to the other side.
Okay, now can you put your hand?
Okay, and then the last group, just to control for the fact that one's gesturing, one's not, we were very tricky. We had them point at the wrong 2 numbers, which I thought that's got to be a disaster. That's going to blow them out of the water. They pointed at the wrong 2 numbers and then pointed at there. But it is pointing at the wrong 2 numbers, but there is something right about it in that it's indicating 2 numbers and 2 sides and whatever. Okay, partially correct. All right.
Do the hand movements exactly how we practice?
I'm gonna make one side equal to the other side.
Okay.
Okay. And then we gave them all instruction. And what happens? Oops, I missed it. Okay. So children who produce the correct gestures did the best. Children who produced no gestures did the worst. This partially correct was in the middle. So this is sort of important because what it suggests is that gesturing, pointing in particular, isn't just about bringing attention to an object. It's also telling you a little bit about how to think about that object, bringing these two together, adding them. There are two sides to the problem. So the gesture isn't just an index pointer, okay? It's a little bit better than a little yellow light, okay? So gesturing can change your mind if we make you do it. Why? I don't know why, but I got a lot of ideas. So here's some ideas. So gesture's grounded in action, but it also represents information. So our thought was that maybe what this helps you do is be concrete in the way you're thinking, while at the same time being abstract, and maybe it can help you move those steps from being concrete to being abstract. Okay, so we gave them, the kids, 3 different kinds of gestures, some not gestures at all. One was action, where they had to do this.
I'm gonna make one side.
I can't hear them all, but she's saying, I want to make one side equal to the other side. And she's picking up the numbers. Another one is concrete gesture. She does the same thing in gesture, but says the same words.
I want to make one side equal to the another side. Okay.
And then the third one was this abstract gesture.
I want one side equal to the other side.
Okay. So then we gave them a post-test. So they were trained on these problems, and then they were tested on problems just like it in exactly the same format, okay? And we looked at the 3 groups, the action kids, the concrete gesture, the abstract gesture. Everybody was pretty good at learning the problems on which they were trained. As you can see, there were no differences. But we also gave them some near transfer problems. So we put the blank on the other side. That's a little tricky, because if you're being taught to point at these 2 and go over here, you can't just be following this in a rote way. You'll get it wrong. Okay, so what happens? The action guys get it wrong, but the gesture guys are okay, both kinds of gesture. Then the last one we did was we gave them no equal addends at all. So you really had to understand mathematical equivalence to do this. And what happens is the action are still at the bottom, and the abstract gesture is the best, concrete is in the middle. So what's happening here is that action certainly helps the kids learn the problems on which they're taught. But if you want to generalize, if you want to get from this problem to a format that is related, gesture is much better. If we teach, our goals are not just to get you to learn this, but to be able to extend this to something else to which it is related. And gesture is better at that. Now we have to figure out why. Because gesture could be helping generalization, or action could be hurting it. And behaviorally, if you look at any behavioral phenomenon, it's going to look the same. It's always going to end up good for action and bad for, good for gesture, bad for action, but you can't tell which is doing. That's not for me, right? I don't have to stop or anything. Okay, good. All right. So these mechanisms are hard to distinguish using behavior. So I have turned to my colleagues who do neuroimaging, and we're trying to look under the hood and figure out what's going on. All right, so this is just the very beginning. This is one study that we've just begun, so feel free to criticize it. So our first step is to try to use FNIRS to see how children's brains respond. We're giving them instruction with either gesture or with action, okay? And we've looked at neural synchrony, which is intersubject correlation between each participant and his group without himself, okay? We did that for gesture, and we did it for action. So we're looking at intersubject correlation, ISC. So what we found is that ISC in the right angular gyrus and the motor areas is higher in gesture than in action. Okay, so they're sort of more synchronized, and there were no other significant anythings for anything. They're more synchronized when they're looking at a gesture lecture, a gesture lesson, than they're looking at an action lesson. And it's, again, there's movement in both. The information's pretty comparable. I mean, they're doing something to these two numbers and putting it in the blank. Okay. But the more interesting result, well, equally interesting result, is that we then looked at the relation between the behavioral improvement and ISC in just the angular gyrus, because that was the only place it was significant. Okay, so we're looking at people who improve, how much they improve, and how synchronized they were. So what we found, here's the trained problems, near transfer problems, far transfer problems. The more kids improved in blue after the lesson, the more synchronized they were. Here's the synchrony, sorry, here's synchrony and here's improvement. So in the gesture conditions, the more they were improving, the more they were getting out of or being synchronized with others on this gesture lesson. In action, it worked the opposite. The more they got invested, in a sense, in the action stimulus and the action lesson, the less they improved. Make sense? Make sense? Okay. All right. So it happened for gesture, not for action. So why? Well, the angular gyrus is involved in processing numerical information and integrating visual information with language processing. It does a lot of stuff. Okay. And the gesture lesson activates this area over the same time course in those who learn. The only thing that all of these different kids have in common is either the gesture stimulus or the action stimulus, which is why we think it's about that. You know, it wasn't, you know, they weren't in the same room at the same time. Okay. And so I think we have pretty good evidence that gesture is helping. It's doing some good work. I don't know if we have evidence yet that action is hurting. Now you might say, oh, who cares? Yes, we sort of should care, because there's a lot of work in mathematical classes, particularly young ones, where teachers pull out manipulatives and they do work on the objects. And maybe that's a good thing to do at the very beginning of learning, but at some point it may not be. So I think we do have to keep pursuing this and figuring out whether action may be hurting, just because it's tying what you know to this instead of letting you pull it out. Okay. Okay. All right. So we know that the mind, we've talked about the mind hidden in hands creating language, the mind hidden in hands accompanying language. So the last question I want to address is whether signers hide their minds in their hands. And if so, they should gesture just like speakers do, and they do. Signers gesture. So to look at this, we went to situations where it's pretty hard to describe the differences between these two things just in words. You can do it, but you use a lot of words. Okay, so we asked English speakers to describe these two things, and they turned to gesture.
Two different humps in the middle and at the bottom.
Okay, so they, you know, all of them, they just couldn't do it without moving their hands. So here's the signer. Signer's great. The signer is also turning to gesture. So what's gesture, what's not sign? That is a hard question. But if you look at this signer, one of the things he's doing that a hearing person never does is look at his mouth. He's great. Never do hearing people do this. Come on, you can do it. It's just great. Okay. So signers clearly do gesture. Come on. But the big question from my point of view is, does gesture have the same cognitive significance for signers and for speakers? This is an important question, and it can help us disentangle something that is really hard to disentangle in hearing people. And that is, it's possible that one of the things that makes gesture so wonderful for learning is because you got two modalities. You've got hand and you've got mouth, and you put them together, and two things are better than one, and that's why you go off. Well, that won't work for sign, because whatever signers are doing for gesture, it's pretty much in the same visual modality, except for the mouth. On the other hand, gesture could be offering a second representational format. Speech and sign divide the world up into discrete units, and there are nice little rules that put everything together. That happens in sign just as in speech. But gesture's a little different. It's not as hierarchical, much more flat, and much more pictorial and imagistic. It seems to convey information in a different way. Now that's true of both gesture and speech and gesture and sign. So if the second point is what's going on here, signers and speakers should look the same. If it's the first, they should look different. Okay, so we asked the question, do signers produce gesture sign mismatches? Is that even possible? And do they predict learning? Okay, so we're going back to mathematical equivalence. This is a deaf kid, deaf parents, who's, she doesn't know how to solve the problem. And what she does is she says, you add, signs, add all, and she gestures as well. She gestures by punking at all 4 of the numbers. So she's actually conveying the same information in her sign and her gestures. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, add all. Okay, I've sort of deconstructed this so that it's a little easier to see. Her sign strategy is add all numbers. Her gesture is to point at all the numbers. So this is a mismatch. I mean, sorry, a match. The kids did it 80% of the time, which seems like a lot, actually. And we didn't know whether it was a lot or not. So we looked at our hearing kids, and it turns out to be about the same amount. Okay. So here's a mismatch. This is a gesture sign mismatch. What she does is she talks about adding up the numbers. Oh, now it's loud again. Adding up the numbers on this side of the problem and putting them in the blank. But she also covers the 7. This is not a sign. This is a gesture. So she's talking about adding up the numbers and putting them in this slot, but she's doing an add subtract as well. So here she goes, and then I'll deconstruct it. Okay. Okay. So in her signs, she does an add to equal signs strategy. But in her gestures, she indicates the covers the 7, which is really sort of add them up on the left side and subtract them on the right. Whatever it is, it's different information. It's definitely different. Okay. So 42% of the kids produce more than 3 of these things. Again, it's pretty comparable to what the hearing kids do. So the numbers are the same. All right. But now the crucial question. Do these gesture sign mismatches predict learning? So what I've done here is I've divided the kids into how many of these different mismatches they produce to begin with. Some produce none. Some produce them on all problems. Okay. So if this works the same way in signers and in speakers, we should find that kids who produce mismatch at the beginning should be very likely to learn, and kids who produce no mismatches at the beginning should not. Okay, and for learning here, we counted 5 out of 6 problems as being learners. And what we found is exactly that. The kids who produced mismatches at the beginning were much more likely to learn than the kids who produced few mismatches at the beginning. Okay, so these are the data I showed you at the very beginning, just to put it in the same format. So this is the data that I just presented to you. So the signers and the speakers look very much the same. This is not about hand and mouth. It's about representational format, which for my money makes it much more interesting than just hand and mouth. Okay. Okay, so gesture sign mismatches predict learning as well as gesture speech mismatches, and it's the juxtaposition of these different representational formats rather than the juxtaposition of 2 modalities. Okay, so gesture serves the same cognitive functions for signers as it does for speakers. All right, so just to pull it all together here, language is resilient. When it can't come out of the mouth, it comes out of the hands. But interestingly, it reveals the fundamentals of mind that contribute to how we shape language, which is what I find really interesting about it. But gesture is also resilient. And it comes for free alongside of speech, if that's what you do, or sign, if that's what you do. And it reflects your thoughts, even thoughts that don't come out of your language. And when it does, it clearly has cognitive significance because it can be a window into whether or not you are going to be ready to learn. Okay, so it has cognitive significance. Okay, so just to put it all on one page, this is what our hands can tell us about our minds that we don't see in language. Home sign tells us about which linguistic structures humans can create on their own. My guess is this is our best guess is what is biologically evolved. The emergence of sign language from home sign can tell us about how transmission changes language, our best guess at what is culturally evolved. And finally, that gesture accompanies language, speech, or sign, and it tells us about how we learn, and more importantly, how we can generalize what we learn, which I think is what's important about learning. So just finally, home sign and gesture provide an unobstructed window onto the mind that is hidden in our hands. So let me thank you for listening. Thank all my many, 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 many collaborators and funders, and open the floor to questions. Anybody got a question? Yes.
First, thank you for setting this up. Again, absolutely cool and fascinating talk. That was well. I'm interested in lots of things that you said, one of which being this difference between gesture and action. Very self-conscious about my gesture suddenly. In the learning study.
I don't grade people.
And so angular gyrus, as you mentioned, is
Yeah.
in lots of different things.
Right.
The temporal parietal junction, which we know is important for theory of the mind.
Right.
And so in this learning context where the children are trying to figure out what is it that this person is trying to communicate by, telling me to do this action or this gesture, I wonder about a role for theory of mind in the difference between gesture and action. So I'm just curious, what were the ages of the kids, and do you see a difference in the comparative advantage of gesture over action as people develop more theory of mind?
Yeah, I didn't tell you about the ages. That was too bad. They're 8 to 10. Actually, in the first round of analyses that we did, we sort of did the analysis a little wrong, but we found some effects in RTPJ. That might be there if we do the analysis more correctly, but I didn't have time to do that before I came. And we did find that there were effects for the gesture condition and not for the action condition, for I think exactly the reasons that you say. I think what the kids are getting out of the gesture input, they're realizing that she's trying to teach them something. And they are then taking advantage of that input. Whereas when the kids see the action instruction, they don't know what she's doing, because the more they pay attention to it, the worse they do. So I think it does have something to do with what they're getting out of this. And you can't learn from gesture unless you recognize it as gesture. Now, that's not the same as producing gesture. So the reason we started with FNIRS to begin with is because you can move when you do these things. So our next step is going to be to look at these kids as they produce gestures and see if that changes producing gestures versus producing action. My guess is that the effects will actually be bigger, but I don't know. I don't know. Thanks for the question. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to probe your distinction between biological and cultural evolution.
Yeah. Yes. Right. That's too bad that you're asking me that, but go ahead. Go ahead.
On one hand, you've got these things that universal in home science systems, and then strong biases in well-established languages.
Right.
So presumably there's an interaction with cultural evolution there.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you've got the things that evolve through cultural evolution must be interacting again with these. With
the biological stuff. Right. Right. Right.
So would it be right to say really what we're talking about here is stronger and weaker biases?
Yeah.
Or is there something else?
No, I think it's stronger and weaker biases. I think that's really the point, because the languages that we have today are an interaction of biological and cultural evolution. But sort of we don't know where to start in figuring out what the possibilities are for biologically given properties and culturally given properties. And what I would think, if we can distinguish the properties that home signers have difficulty with, it's hard to do it, because if a home signer doesn't do it, maybe it's because I looked in the wrong place. Maybe it's my fault, not them. So it's never definitive. But if they don't do it, it does suggest to me that you needed transmission or somebody else to help you with it, that there really isn't something that you can do on your own. And then we have to figure out what are the conditions. I'm also very interested in the possibility, this communication versus transmission stuff versus learning. I frankly would have thought that communicating would make a bigger boost when you start to share it, when you're not just putting it out. Because I think for home signers, and this is really too strong, but in a way, it is projection of their cognition for communication. It really is. I honestly don't think it's about the listener at all, other than trying to say something, but not sort of looking, at you going, are you getting this? I'm doing this just for you. I don't think it's about that. I think it's just the structure of their minds. And then when you come in contact with somebody else and they do something different, wouldn't you change it then? Not so much. It looks more like there's a big change when you learn it. So that also is sort of, it's an interesting take on cultural evolution. Yeah. Say again?
It's like, say dogs.
Yeah.
They just feel like maybe with their tongue.
Or their nose or something like that. Well, mine doesn't. She's not very good at gesturing. I don't know. She's not very good at most things, but she's very cute. I don't think they do. I mean, I'm working now with Kat Hobiter to try to figure out whether, I mean, chimps and gorillas and all those guys, they do use their hands in certain ways. To what extent are they the same? And how are they different from the gestures that we find in these kids? I think that's, when you look at the creatures, they find imperative gestures, gestures and request situations. But it's partly because that's how they define it. You have to be able to see whether somebody has responded to it. We find it all the time in both request and comment situations. But we'd like to sort of explore the contexts in which both the kids and the animals are doing this and see how much similarity and how much difference there is. I do think they gesture. I don't think they're totally the same. I really don't. I think that there's a difference, but that needs to be cashed out because right now we're using different systems to describe the two, and that isn't helping us. That's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. That's a really good question. I mean it much more specifically than that. So when you exhibit a gesture-speech mismatch on this problem, it's really learning that problem that you are going to have a leg up on. And in fact, we did do some studies of conservation and math. Math is acquired later than conservation. Kids would be matching on conservation, but mismatching on math. It's not a personality trait. It's not that you are a mismatcher and you are a learner. It's that with respect to this problem, you have unbalanced knowledge and you actually have more knowledge than you are getting out in your mouth. And that is what I find really interesting. There's something that's really, it's tied to your hands. Why can't you get it out? What is it about it? What makes it stay in there? But it's only with respect to a particular problem. It's not in general. Thank you. That was a really important point to make. Yeah.
I want to ask Eric about your cultural versus
Yeah. Please do. Push me. I might make Robert answer the question, but that's okay.
But maybe I'm saying the same thing you're thinking. So is it possible that, it sounds like you're saying something like, when you arrive, your cognition has certain affordances that you can then map onto these languages, and they're a bit more limited, but they're there. Could it be possible that in a language that already exists, there's a lot more affordances that are there?
Yes.
That express meaning that
right.
once learned, you're like, oh, these I can unlock as well.
Right.
I don't actually need any more than that.
Right.
It just wouldn't occur to me without that.
Mm-hmm.
Then I thought maybe that's what you mean when you're saying cultural evolution, or is that?
Well, I think what I mean by cultural evolution is that you have a model before you that you are building on. So in a way, the simple explanation for this plural thing is, well, you can't use plural in a bunch of different places until you have plural. Now, the home centers have plural, so it's not just enough, but at least you need plural. But so I do think that they're good bets for cultural evolution. And then the home sign, they don't need transmission. Whether or not they were early in our biological evolution, I don't really know. But I think I can say that they don't need transmission. So it's a simpler cut than I think I was making. Yeah. Yeah.
Great compliment. Are there any interesting phenomena or effects that play out as gesture? So
Yeah, that's very interesting. We did, I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that if you have a prosthesis, we looked at people with prostheses and looked to see whether they gestured with them. And some do and some don't, or they gesture a lot or a little. And the ones who gesture a lot are the ones who say they are comfortable with their hand. They own their hand. So it feels like it's part of their body. I don't want to end up saying that you have to be able to gesture to learn math or to learn language. It cannot be true. It just has to not be true. But it could be that you learn more quickly. Maybe you learn in a different way, but I don't even know if I want to say that. That seems to be pushing me too far, and I don't think I want to go there. But I think you can say for sure that you learn more quickly. If you didn't have any arms at all, you still can move. And there is this wonderful example from Ramachandran who talks about a woman without arms, a patient of his who comes in and says, I use my arms all the time to gesture. They're moving right now as I talk to you. And then he said, really? She said, yeah. And I want you to know that they don't move when I walk. That's pretty good. What she's suggesting is that this gesturing movement is different from regular old movement, which I find a little fascinating. That's really pretty cool. Yeah.
I'm curious about this point at the end, and actually maybe related to with this question, but how signers will have signs that will have gestures.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of parallel speech, right? Like, is there verbal gesturing? And so can gesturing come in different modalities?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I have a student, Casey Ferrara, who's just finished her dissertation, is going off to Colgate to continue research on it. So she's been studying what she's called local gesture. It's been a long day when you just exaggerate the length of your word, or very, very, very quickly, or something like that. And I actually think that's in a way closer to what signers do, because most of sign gestures are overlaid onto their signs. So we've been trying to figure out how comparable those two things are, whether they're processed in the same way. So I think that's a really nice insight in that. And vocal gesture is definitely picking up on all these mimetic kinds of things. It's a little more limited because it's related to sound and temporalness and things like that. But absolutely, yes, I agree. And Casey Ferrara is the person to watch. Any other questions? Yes, John.
I don't know.
Well, we'll see.
Thanks again for terrific talk. I have always been fascinated about the gesture of blind people.
Yeah,
For example,
yeah.
Terrific. And it really led me to wonder about what you think about these distinctions you are making between action versus gesture and using it for communication.
Yeah.
When you embed it into the mathematical problem work, I'm trying to imagine what a blind person might do who's trying to learn math, and will they generate these same kinds of mismatches in gesture? And are you going to get the exact same kinds of findings for it? Because they don't have to use that gesture to communicate.
Right. But I don't actually think these guys are using it to communicate either. I think they're, when they generate it for themselves, it's for them. It has to be a little comparable. So we did 3 tasks, Jen Iverson and I, when we did the blind initially. Conservation, their gestures were identical, the blind and the sighted. Narrative, we gave them the narrative, and neither. Yes, blind with conservation. Yes, we have, sorry. And we found very comparable things in conservation. In narration, nobody gestured, and neither one did. Space was different, though. We asked them to talk about where they were going because they have a different sense of space. So sighted people, were gesturing all over the place. But for the blind, they don't see down the hall. They didn't gesture as much, and they had very different kinds of gestures. So what Jana then did was she used a smaller space like this for each of them. And then the blind could get it in one grasp, and they would gesture there too. So I really think it depends on their conceptual understanding. If we could give them a math task which had, Braille numbers and Braille whatever, they might then gesture to it. But if we didn't, so we'd have to get the conceptual part correct. But I don't think we did the mismatch stuff because they weren't learners. I mean, they weren't learners at the time. I know they do produce gesture, but I don't know that gesture predicts mismatch. And it would be interesting to know. I have no reason to think it wouldn't, but it would be important to know, to actually know. We haven't done the mismatch stuff anywhere. I think it's important to do it. I mean, we've done it here, but we haven't done it in any other culture. I think it would be important to do that because gesture is at least said to have different functions. I would predict that it would be the same in all cultures, but I really do think it's important for me to do it. I just haven't done it. It's probably not top of the Trump list either. Yeah, yeah. That's a really great question about anything, not just the plural thing. I think, because I can't just say, well, hey, you got to have the plural in order to generalize that they all have the plural. I've been thinking a lot about it because it's only in these, I mean, the plural in a way highlights the object. It doesn't really do the agency as much. And it may be that objectifying it. We also know that the second cohort is not so good at inventing the first and home sign cohorts are not so good at inventing devices that downplay the agent, like passives. But the second cohort is. So it may be something about the salience of the agent and being able to downplay it, and the first and the home sign don't. Now, that's not a general principle. That's more about this particular plural thing. And I think the general principle is, that you need a model for it, but why? I mean, I think that's a question, that's really interesting that we should continue to talk about. Why do you need a model for that and not for something? That's just, in a way, it's just begging the question, but it's putting it in a different way. But I think that, yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks. Yes.
Basic interpretation about the person who was born blind since birth, and then you were saying that, okay, like she couldn't see people having gesture, that like she just intuitively that. I may have missed it in one half, so you were saying like that why she started to like kind of like have gesture when she speaks. Is it like a kind of emotional thing, or is it like a kind of like spatial organization or certain kind of information mind, or like I may have missed that part?
Well, we don't know why she starts to gesture. I do have videotapes from Lila Gleitman, actually, and Barbara Lando, of little blind children very young, and they point all the time. So they do that. They aren't told to do it. They even point proximally, not just distally. So it's there very early. I think what I've been thinking is that it's tied to speech. So that hand and mouth do go together in the sense that or sign, language and gesture go together in that sense. But the function it serves, whether it is emotion, I think, yes, what you said, it organizes things spatially. Is that the drive? I think it may be more the drive that when you communicate in this language-like way, then you also gesture. But the interesting thing about home signers, which I didn't say, is that I don't think they gesture. Initially, they're starting to do these discrete things with, whatever. They do that first. And we haven't been able to find the smushy gestures that go along with that. So there's something about, if you're going to invent a language, you're going to go for a linguist language, and then later on overlay the gesture. And I don't even know if it happens in home sign. We need to study adult home signers. So yeah.
Somehow some people argue that if it's baby newborn babies, they kind of have certain kind of gesture, like consistent with some sort of like prosody of their language or something. So I wonder if this kind of gestural movement is sort of partially innate, like, or not. Like, what do you think about it?
Well, I think that gestures seem, I don't know that it's innately tied to speech, but I know it doesn't require visual input. So somewhere between that and innate, yeah. I mean, it's very robust. Let's put it that way. I don't know even when kids come out, whether the gestures that they produce are affected by the prosody of their mothers. I mean, we could study that. We could look at that. Initially, most kids are doing points, which are pretty non-prosodic, but we certainly could look at the onset of prosody. And we just don't know very much about that at all. Sure.
I have a question about the
Last one.
Who did these mismatches on the math problems. The gestures that they did, were those gestures always kind of closer to the real solution to the problem than their speech was? Is there a clue in the gesture as to?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the conservation, it was, right? This one-to-one correspondence. But if you notice in the math, it wasn't, because in the math, they did one wrong solution in speech and another wrong solution in gesture. But what I think is really important is that both of them indicate parts of the problem that need to be thought about to get the correct solution. It has to be relevant to the problem. We haven't been able to ask that particular question of kids because the only gestures they produce are relevant to the problem. But we did this with adults learning stereoisomers and their gestures. Sometimes the adults, when they learn stereoisomers, are giving explanations that are way out to lunch and they're not even close to the problem. You produce a mismatch like that, it gets you nowhere. Your mismatches have to be relevant to the problem. So it isn't just, hey, I've done something different in mouth and hand. They have to both be relevant. Either one has to be correct or one or not, but they have to be relevant. I think it's really information you got in your head and you can't integrate it. For some reason, you can't integrate it. That's what we have to figure out. Why not? It's there. Why can't you integrate it? So, to be discovered. Ready?
I'd like all of us to thank our speakers.
Thank you.